Thank you. I think I'd like to start with a little chant that I learned when I was ordained in the Theravadan tradition, briefly. And those of you who live here, certainly, and those of you who are familiar with Theravadan practice probably know this. And it's basically saying homage to the One, to the Lord, to the worthy One, to the fully enlightened One. And as we chant that, I'll chant it first once, and then I'll chant each section, and you can chant afterwards, after you hear me chant. It's very simple and easy. I think you'll be able to catch on to it fine, and some of you may already be familiar with it. But I think what it's pointing to, homage to the One, to the Lord, to the worthy One, to the fully enlightened One. This is in memory of the Buddha, whose teaching is taught here on a regular basis. But it's not only referring to the Buddha who lived so many thousands of years ago and who taught the Dharma to many people, and the Buddhist teaching that's still going on. It's actually referring to the Buddha within you, the Christ within you. And that's what today is about. It's about hopefully touching into that aspect of who you are, that divine kind of essence that we all share, and that is represented in the figures of the Buddha and also in the figure of the Christ. So when we chant it, we're chanting it actually to the Buddha within. We're chanting it to the One, the awakened One within our own hearts. So we can remember that. And after I do the chant, we'll do a little thing where I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, I take refuge in the Sangha, which means I take refuge in the awakened One within me, I take refuge in the teaching that leads to awakening, and I take refuge in the community of awakened ones, which is all of us. All of us already have that clarity, that understanding, that wisdom within us. So today's like this, even though it's very brief, it's hopefully to help us get in touch with that aspect of wisdom and compassion that already dwells deep in our own hearts. So I'd like to share this little chant with you. As I said, I'll chant it once. There's just 3 lines to it. And then I'll chant the second time and third time we chant it. I'll chant each section, and you can follow. I think you'll catch on. I do it, okay? Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddham saranam gacchami. Dhammam saranam gacchami. Sangham saranam gacchami. There's a little saying attributed to Saint Francis of Assisi, my patron who I'm named after, who was known to be one of the most Christ-like saints that ever was, who really mirrored the energy, the consciousness of Christ. in many early hagiographical accounts of his life, he's called the mirror of Christ. Francis, the mirror of Christ. And he was so like Christ that at one point, later in his life, he had appear in his flesh the wounds of Christ, known as the stigmata. Now, whether that's some psychological aberration or whatever it is, I think it points to a person who is very focused on the image, the symbol of Christ, and in love with that symbol, and really in his own flesh even mirroring that symbol. And there's a little saying attributed to him where he said, "Preach the gospel wherever you go. If necessary, use words." So you could say, preach the Dharma wherever you go. If necessary, use words. So the greatest preaching of the teaching that leads to liberation is not ever in words. It's always by one's life, by not only one's actions, but by the spirit that animates one, by the kind of energy that a person lives in. That's what really preaches. When I was doing my pastoral training to be a chaplain in hospitals and hospice, I had a Baptist minister who was my supervisor, my CPE supervisor, my clinical pastoral education supervisor. And we go through a residency like doctors or social workers or people like that do. So chaplains, as part of their credential earning experience, they go through what they call a residency. And so we have a whole panel of CPE residents, different various clergy from different religions. We had all kinds of people. We even had a Buddhist guy who was studying to be a chaplain. We had a Jewish woman, very progressive Jewish woman rabbi. I was a Catholic monk. We had Catholic sisters. We had Protestant ministers, so we had all kinds. And the supervisor was Reverend Orrin Newberry, Southern Baptist minister, who I really loved. Completely different tradition and background than me, but we really hit it off, you could say. And we were often giving little accounts of our experiences, our pastoral experiences with people. That was part of our residency. We'd do what we called a verbatim. So we'd write down an account of some pastoral encounter we'd had with someone. And sometimes they were very powerful. Some of you may have read my book, and I talk about my Zen master, Mary, a woman I worked with, who I may talk about today, and who it was a very powerful influence on me and really a teacher for me of surrender, of the practice of surrender. And so we were often sharing with these verbatims. We'd write them out almost like a script, and we would play ourselves, and we'd get different people to play the various roles in the verbatim. And sometimes the story itself would just be very cathartic and powerful. And Orrin used to always say something when we'd have a powerful story that was told, and he'd say, in his very Southern Baptist kind of way, he'd say, "That'll preach. That will preach," And I guess that's what that saying of St. Francis is pointing to, is that we preach the gospel, we preach the good news, we preach something wherever we go. Whether we know it or not, whether we like it or not, whether other people like it or not, we preach, but more by our example than by our words. So today we're going to reflect on the embrace of Jesus and Buddha. And I think that the embrace of Jesus and Buddha that I want to share with you is the embrace of Jesus and Buddha that happened within my own heart, because that's where they embraced for me, in my own heart. I grew up in an Irish Catholic family, Irish-American Catholic family, somewhat similar to maybe an Irish Catholic family, but not exactly the same, but probably some of the same traditions, some of the same spirit to it. And I had a mother who was very pious and very holy person, actually, went to Mass every day, and so on. I had an aunt who was a Carmelite nun, so I was raised with a lot of people who really had a deep faith, a deep heartfelt faith, and a faith in Jesus and a devotion to Jesus. So I grew up with this sense of devotion to Jesus. I remember as a very little small child going to church. One of my first memories of church being kind of spiritually significant to me was when I was the ring bearer at my cousin Jeannie's wedding. And I was all of 4 years old. And I think it was just significant in my memory simply because it was a big event in my life. You know, they dressed my brother. I had a twin brother, and we were both ring bearers. And then we had twin sisters that were cousins that were the flower girls. So we were like little mini brides and grooms. And the little girls were in white dresses, and we were in tuxedos, you know, and 4 years old. And we thought we were pretty cool, you know, in our little tuxes. And then we had to walk down the aisle holding these silk cushions with the ring on the cushion. So it was very special. But I remember going into church that time and with one of my other cousins, Bernie's, the groom's brother, who later I thought of as a cousin, and Charlie, used to call him Uncle Charlie. And he was probably a guy in his, I don't know, he seemed very old to me when I was 4, but I think he was like 35 or something. And so he was kind of in charge of me, you know, and then there was somebody else in charge of my brother, and then I think there were women in the wedding party who were in charge of the 2 little girls, because here we had 4 kids that were about 4 or 5 years old, so somebody needed to be in charge of us, obviously. So I remember being in church, and one really significant thing was him telling me, kneel, stand, kneel, stand, kneel, stand. And I remember thinking, gosh, there's a lot of kneeling and standing. Because when I would go to Mass with my mom, I remember just sitting in the pew coloring. That was my memory of church. Oh, that's where you go to color, you know, because I had all these coloring books I would work in. I loved artwork even then. So I would have a lot of coloring time in church. But this time I had to kind of be part of the whole thing. And something that I noticed when I was in that wedding party as the little ring bearer and kneeling and standing was the light at the front of the church, which somehow or other I had failed to notice very much before that. But I remember very specifically looking at the candle that was lit by the tabernacle that contained the Blessed Sacrament, which as Catholics, many of you probably come from a Catholic background, you know, we had this idea that that's the real presence of Christ. And I remember seeing the candle burning up there, thinking, well, that's special. There's a candle burning up there. There's something special about that. And I asked Uncle Charlie, what's that candle up there? You know, like 4-year-olds do. What's that? What's that? What's that? Who's that? So I said, what's that candle up there? And he said, that's letting us know that Jesus is here, that Jesus is living here. And I was really struck by that. I thought, wow, Jesus. I remember hearing about Jesus, and I thought that was really neat, that Jesus was here, and the candle proved that he was here. And somehow that started something in my little heart, you know, a sense of the presence. And I felt some sort of presence when he said that, something special about a presence. And I couldn't name it. I hadn't studied theology at 4, didn't have a lot of doctrine in my mind. And my mom, even though she was very pious, wasn't a real doctrinal person anyway. She's more kind of a love heart person. Talked a lot about God being love, but not much about doctrine. So I didn't really have a lot of doctrine in my little 4-year-old mind. But I knew enough to know a presence when I felt it. And I felt it. And it was special. And somehow, when I'd go into church after that, I remembered that. And I'd look at that little candle and I'd think, Jesus is here. You know, and that was my sense of devotion at that time. And as I grew up, that became sort of stronger in me. And I remember going to benediction. So we would go to benediction where they take the Blessed Sacrament, the host, out of the tabernacle. They put it in a monstrance, a golden kind of case that has usually rays coming out. And they'd put it on the altar with candles. They'd burn incense. We'd sing hymns. And then I remember my mom saying also, that's Jesus. That's Jesus in that piece of bread. And I felt again that presence. So I grew up with this sense of presence. But somehow, real early on, I also had heard, somehow or other, about the Buddha. And there was something about the Buddha that really struck me. And I remember there was this show on, this was in the 70s when I was growing up. Some of you may remember it, and I don't know if it was over here in Europe. I imagine it was, though, like a lot of kind of American TV shows. And it was called Kung Fu. Do you remember that? It was this David Carradine, and he played this I guess it was a Buddhist monk of some kind, a Shaolin priest, and he was in this monastery. And I remember as a little kid watching that show and feeling some sort of a pull, some sort of an attraction, and feeling somehow very familiar to me. This guy living in this monastery with this master who was blind, and it was very scenic and all kinds of beautiful costumes and things. And it probably struck my childish imagination in some way. But I think there was something else there too that was striking me and pulling me and attracting me about the Buddha somehow by that. And when I was probably about 10, I went to, my mom liked antiques, and so she would often go to these antique shows, and we lived in Columbus, Ohio, which is the capital, and there's a state fairgrounds there, and often growing up, and still to this day, they have antique shows there in the various fairground buildings, and so they'd have these big, huge buildings rented out with all these antique vendors, and they'd bring all their little knickknacks and furniture and all kinds of things and sell them there in the mall. And we would often go there because my mom kind of collected antiques and liked antiques. And I was probably, by that time, maybe 10 or 11, I'm thinking. And I saw this little figure that seemed to be like a white porcelain kind of figure of an Asian woman, very beautiful, very graceful, and holding a lotus, holding a stem, a lotus stem, with this very graceful kind of holding the stem, almost like a baby holding the stem, and her hand raised in some fashion, some sort of stylized look. And I remember feeling this big attraction to it. And somehow I went to my mother and said, "Can I have that?" And she said, "No, you don't need that." And she said, for some reason, I begged her to get it for me. And I said, "It's Mary. It's the Virgin Mary. And I want it." And my mom said, "No, it's not the Virgin Mary. It's some Japanese woman." She said, "It's not the Virgin Mary." I said, No. I was insistent. "It's the Virgin Mary. It's the Virgin Mary." And she said, normally I was pretty docile kid and I didn't ask for a lot and I didn't kind of bug her about getting things for me. But for some reason I was fixated on this thing. And so she bought it for me and I took it home and I put a rosary around its neck and put it in my room, and I used to pray the rosary by it. And I thought it was Mary. And it turned out later when I entered the monastery of the Trappists and I started studying Buddhism that I found out that it was Kuan Yin, the Bodhisattva of compassion. And that's her. She's right here. I brought her with me because whenever I give talks, I like to have her. This is her. It's very beautiful. And it's interesting because, and she's sitting on a little blessing scarf that Adya Shanti gave me recently when he asked me to be a part of his Open Gate Sangha. So that means something to me too. So these are two special things for me. And I felt this childish kind of attraction to that figure and to the energy it sort of gave off. And I associated it with the Virgin Mary. And I think I was right. I think in a way it is the Virgin Mary, in a certain sense. It represents that same spirit. And the Virgin Mary, I think, for many people in the West, and especially from a Catholic background, represents a kind of divine feminine, a sacred feminine. We don't really have goddesses in the Christian tradition or Judeo-Christian tradition. But the Virgin Mary, in a way, is kind of a goddess figure, isn't she? She's a sacred woman that represents that aspect of divinity. And so there was something that kind of called to my heart in that image and in the image of the Buddha. And I felt a very similar feel, a very similar energetic quality between the Buddha and Christ. A little bit different kind of feel, which I'll go into a little more today as we go on through the day. But in some ways, a kind of common spirit there, what they represented. Carl Jung, who was one of the groundbreaking people in psychoanalysis and a student of Freud and very, very influential in modern psychology, had the idea that he talked about in his collected works. If you ever have time to read them, I would suggest they're very helpful. And for people on a spiritual search especially. And he talked a lot about archetypes, which are kind of universal symbols of something or other. So Jesus and Buddha and Mary and Kuan Yin and any number of other figures are archetypes. And they're universal symbols. They somehow point to something that all human beings somehow can recognize to a certain extent. And even as a child, there was something in me that resonated with that energy of Jesus, the Christ, and the Buddha, the enlightened one. And there was something there that I felt was similar. They were somehow pointing to something. I started doing some online courses. My most recent one was called Full Circle Awakening, which I set up like on a kind of page of my website. I'm starting this thing. It's like a virtual school, like a kind of online school called the School for Contemplative Living. So my first course was Full Circle Awakening. But my next course that I'm going to start when I get home is going to be called The Secrets of the Christian and Sufi Mystics. And one of the secrets of mystics from those traditions, those monotheistic traditions, is that they have a devotional symbol or an archetype that they relate to. There's a beautiful saying that's attributed to Adi Shankara, who's the founder of Hindu Advaita Vedanta, and which is Advaita means literally not two. So it's a teaching pointing to the oneness of reality, the kind of non-duality, sometimes it's called the non-dual teaching. That's the ultimate reality, has a non-dual nature, or the nature of oneness, of unity. And so his teaching was all about how ultimately everything is one, that there's no separation. And I think the Buddha had a very similar teaching if you really boil it down. But one thing that Adi Shankara is quoted as saying is that even the greatest realized saints and sages retain a remnant of duality for the sake of devotion. It's beautiful, isn't it? They retain a remnant of duality, or an appearance, you could say, of duality for the sake of devotion. So the Buddha and the Christ can be symbols of devotion for us. For me, I had a sense of devotion to both the Buddha and the Christ in different ways. Even as a child, there was something very familiar about the Buddha, even though I hadn't heard very much about him, hadn't been exposed to him. But somehow, the minute I heard about him, I immediately associated him with what I felt and knew about the Christ in my heart. That sense of this being a divine person somehow. And when we started this talk, I did the Namo Tassa, homage to the One. Sometimes it says homage to him, but I prefer homage to the One because it makes it not gender specific. It's just homage to that one. That's what it's saying. Homage to that one. The Lord, the worthy one, the enlightened one, the fully enlightened one, the perfectly enlightened one. Sama, Sambuddhasa. in Pali. And I think what those images of Jesus and Buddha are representing, and what we're feeling devotion to when we sing chants to either one, when we kind of show homage to them, or we kind of show respect to them when we come into a place like this and we show respect to the Buddha statue. It's partly to the person, the historical person of the Buddha, who started the turning of the wheel of the Dharma and started teaching his teaching on liberation. But it's not limited to that. The secrets of the Christian and Sufi mystics is that they retain that remnant of duality for the sake of devotion. So they have this symbol, this archetype of the sacred person, the divine person, embodied in these archetypal forms of Jesus, the Buddha. And they have this sense of devotion to that. But eventually, they start with this sense of devotion and intimacy with that. I remember as a child feeling that with Jesus, feeling like I had this relationship with Jesus. It was very real to me. He was my buddy, He was with me all the time. I talked to him incessantly, And you could say, that was the imagination of a little boy. But I think there was something more to that. Intuitively, that's what I felt inclined to do. To talk to Jesus, to tell him all my secrets, to tell him all my hopes and all my deepest thoughts and desires, and to share everything with him. And I heard stories about him, and I wanted to be like him. I heard stories about his kindness and his compassion and love and his wisdom and understanding. I heard these beautiful, touching stories about the woman caught in adultery. You probably know the story, where they catch a woman in adultery and they bring her before Jesus and they say, Lord, here is this woman. She was caught in adultery in the very act. And the law of Moses says we should stone such a one as this. And it says Jesus bent down and wrote in the sand. Just kind of doodled in the sand and kind of ignored them. And they kept going on, throwing accusations at her, holding her in front of them. She's crying. She's all upset and disheveled and embarrassed, of course. And they bring her to him, and they're there, making all their accusations and their judgments. And Jesus just continues to doodle in the sand. And they just keep it up and keep it up. And it says eventually, in the Gospels, it says, and if you go back to the original Greek, it's saying this. It says, and then he straightened up. It says he straightened up, or he stood up straight. So he had been bending down, kind of just dismissing their concerns. And then he stood up straight to address them, to address these accusations against her. And he picked up a stone from the ground, and he said, let the one among you who is without sin throw the first stone. Here. And it said, one by one, starting with the oldest, they each walked away quietly. So I'd hear stories like that, and I was really touched by them. And I thought, what a wonderful person. What a compassionate, wise person this Jesus was. Like I say, my mom was my main sort of tutor in the faith, was not a highly dogmatic person. She was a person filled with love and faith, but not very theological, really. And she just presented Jesus to me from the gospel stories. And we had a little book of the Bible that was written, kind of a child's Bible. She would read us stories about Jesus. And she would read us stories about St. Francis as well. And I'd hear about him. I was named after him. My confirmation name was Francis. wasn't my birth name. I was called Dale for most of my life. But Francis was my confirmation name. And then when I entered religious life, I took the name of Francis eventually. Because I loved St. Francis, mostly because he was so Christ-like. He was like Jesus. He became like Jesus. He kind of was animated with that same energy, with that same consciousness of the Christ. And he displayed that in his life. You know? And somehow that really spoke to me deeply. And there was something about that that I wanted to emulate in my own life. And so I prayed that I would be able to be like Jesus. And I prayed to Jesus that I would be able to be like Jesus. And I talked to him. And I had this growing sense of intimacy with him. And when I was probably about 13 or so, my mom had gotten involved in the Catholic Charismatic Renewal. Some of you might know a little about that. It was a kind of revival movement, not only in the Catholic Church, but it swept through all the various Christian denominations in the late 60s and 70s and into the 80s. And it's still going on, really. But my mom got involved with that. And a lot of that was sort of composed of a lot of lively singing with clapping and raising your hands and singing joyfully to God. And even these conferences we go to in a prayer meeting we went to every week in the parish in the basement of Christ the King Church, they do this thing that they called singing in the Spirit. Singing in the Spirit was singing with this charismatic gift of tongues people had received, where they'd speak in different prayer languages, what they thought of as languages. And I remember as a kid hearing that and being mesmerized by that. Gosh, these people are speaking languages they never learned. That's like a miracle. That seems wonderful to me. And when they'd sing in the Spirit, they would make up these melodies, and there'd be counter harmonies and melodies all blending in together. And it sounded like a kind of melodic cacophony of like angels singing or something. And I remember feeling a sense of presence in that back to when I was like in church. And somehow Jesus represented for me that sense of a human being living in the presence of God, or sort of somehow manifesting in their life the presence of God. So I had this deep sense of intimacy. And at the same time, like I say, not knowing much about the Buddha, but hearing a little bit about the Buddha and having a kind of popular notion of the Buddha, I associated it somehow with Christ. It seemed very similar to me. And just like I associated Kuan Yin with the Virgin Mary, I think I was right in a way. And I think in a certain sense, the figure of the Buddha, the figure of the Christ, they certainly had their teaching. You know, the Buddha's teaching, you can go back and read the Pali Canon, which I got very interested in at one point in my monastic career, to the point that I ordained in the Theravadan tradition. But I even studied Pali, so I could go back and read the original language, the texts in the original language. I was really interested in hearing the teaching that was attributed to the historical Buddha. And so there is this vast teaching. There's all these, there's short discourses, middle-length discourses, long discourses of the Buddha that are actually attributed to the historical Buddha. There was some period of kind of an oral tradition and all that, so whether or not those words were the exact words the Buddha spoke is debatable historically on an academic level. But there is definitely a connection to the original teaching of the historical Buddha and a lot of the Pali Canon. So we can go back and we can read that and we can study that and come to understand that on some level intellectually, and hopefully on a deeper level even than intellectually. And the teaching of the Christ as well. We can go back and read the Gospels. We can read commentaries on the Gospels by great saints and mystics. We can read various mystical teachings that kind of sprung out of the Scripture, the Gospel, and the writings of St. Paul in people like Meister Eckhart and John of the Cross and these great mystics who were real kind of experiential people that actually had a deep experience of realization or a sense of the presence of God. So we can go back and read all that and study that. And that can be useful and helpful. And I would certainly encourage any of you, if you have the interest and the time and the inclination, to go back and do those studies. And hopefully they'll be of benefit to you. But I think that the real sort of connection we make with Jesus and Buddha is even on a different level than the words themselves. It's like that saying that St. Francis, I quoted at the beginning, preach the teaching of liberation, the gospel, the Dharma. Preach it wherever you go. If necessary, use words. So that's pointing to the essence of the teaching, which really is on a level maybe beneath the words. Hopefully any words that come forth are rising out of that living reality of the teaching. You know, when we take refuge in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, we're taking refuge not in the words of the Pali Canon. We're taking refuge in the living teaching, which is also not confined to the Buddha Dharma. You can find it in the Sufi mystics. You can find it in the Christian mystics. You can find it in the great Hindu saints and sages. The teaching, the real Dharma, is universal. It transcends words. It transcends holy books. You know, any teaching I give is not about the words. You know, if I speak interesting, accurate words that are based on various ancient teachings and things, that's all well and good. But the real teaching is silence. The real teaching is silent presence. That hopefully any words I share are arising out of that. That's what gives the words power. That's what makes the teaching transformative. That's what makes it go to the heart. You know, there's a little passage in St. Paul where he talks about the Holy Spirit which comes forth in teaching that's inspired. And it says, it divides bone and marrow. It goes straight to the heart. And that's the teaching that arises out of silence. That's the teaching that arises out of presence. And that's the main teaching of the figures of the Buddha and Jesus. Even though they both, in the body, long ago died, there was something so powerful about the teaching of their lives that it still streams forth, even beyond the words. Just the figure of the Buddha. When you come in here and look at the statue of the Buddha, or you look at a statue of Kuan Yin, or you look at an icon of Jesus, there's an energy, there's a consciousness, there's a presence that rushes forth, that flows out, that radiates. And somehow the heart knows what it is. Beyond the words, the heart knows. You recognize it. And you recognize it in those who embody it. Somehow that spirit, they preach that. You know, if necessary, they use words. But if not, their life radiates that presence. And it's the same presence that's represented in the Buddha, in the Jesus, in the Christ. And that's really what we're called to. That's why we do days like this. That's why we meditate. That's why we do spiritual practice. We might start with a remnant of duality for the sake of devotion. We might start with Jesus or the Buddha as a figure that we admire, that we somehow see outside of ourselves. And we might want to draw close to that. We might want to be intimate with that. But eventually, the secret of the mystics is that they start with devotion, with intimacy, and they move from intimacy to identification. They interiorize that intimacy with the Christ, that intimacy with the enlightened one, and they realize that the living Christ, the enlightened one, the worthy one, the Lord, dwells in their own heart. They get in touch with the living presence within them. And hopefully today, I like to give people little experiments with the truth that they can actually try on and get in touch with this living presence in their own heart. Because this presence lives in all of you already. It always has and always will. And the value of any teaching is just to point you back toward that presence within you. The value of any teaching, any spiritual practice, is to help you access that living presence in your own heart. And hopefully today, in some very simple ways, and we don't have a lot of time, we only have one day, but hopefully we can point to that living presence in your heart. And you can have a glimpse of it. You can have a taste of it. I believe in breaking about once an hour. Because I find that the human attention span generally lasts between 45 minutes to 60 minutes in focused people. In non-focused people, it might be 10 minutes, but I'm assuming you're all focused types since you're here.